In a land where power decides everything, a single marriage could change the fate of an entire empire. A widow fighting to keep her land, a stranger hiding a secret that could take it all away, and enemies waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But when the truth begins to surface, who really owns the land and who owns the heart? Because sometimes true strength is choosing not to take, but to give. On this channel, we tell stories of the Wild West, about love, courage, family, and the unseen kindness between people. If you're curious how this unfolds, like, comment, share, and subscribe. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Thank you for being part of our community.
The dust of Mercer's Bend tasted like old regrets and dry copper. Elias Thorne pulled the brim of his Stetson low against the glaring Montana sun, his thumb resting instinctively on the worn handle of his Colt .45. He rode a midnight black gelding that had seen more miles than most men, moving at a slow, deliberate walk toward the white-steepled church at the end of town. In his breast pocket, tucked right over his heart, was a blood-stained letter. His father's dying wish. Go to the Sterling Ranch, marry the widow, settle the debt. Elias had spent 3 weeks in the saddle expecting to find a weeping, helpless woman dressed in mourning black, desperate for a hired gun to keep the wolves at bay. He was a man who lived by a strict, quiet code, and a debt of blood was a debt he would pay. He just hadn't expected to pay it the moment he stepped off his horse. The first gunshot shattered the stained glass window of the church before Elias even hit the top step. Glass rained down on the wooden planks like jagged hail. Elias didn't flinch. He dropped low, his Colt clearing its holster in a smooth, lethal blur, and kicked the heavy oak doors open. Inside, the house of God was a war zone. Pews were overturned. The preacher was cowering behind the altar, clutching a Bible like a shield. But it wasn't the 5 hired guns shooting up the sanctuary that made Elias freeze. It was the bride. Lady Victoria Sterling did not weep. She stood behind the splintered remains of the front pew, dressed in an intricate ivory silk wedding gown that was already stained with soot and red Montana dirt. Her dark hair had escaped its elegant pins, falling wildly over her shoulders. But her hands were perfectly steady. She racked the lever of a Winchester 1873, the brass catching the sunlight streaming through the bullet holes, and fired. The man flanking the aisle went down with a heavy thud. "You're late, mister." "Thorne," she called out over the ringing echo of the gunshot, her voice carrying the sharp, aristocratic clip of an English upbringing that had no business surviving out here. "Traffic," Elias grunted. He moved. 3 quick, deafening cracks from his Colt sent 2 more of Silas Vance's thugs diving for the side exits. The remaining 2 didn't wait around to see if Elias had a 4th bullet ready. They scrambled out the broken side windows, leaving a trail of curses and blood. The sudden silence in the church was heavier than the gunfire. The air was thick with the acrid, biting scent of cordite and burning wood. Elias slowly holstered his weapon, his boots crunching over shattered glass as he walked down the aisle toward the woman he was supposed to marry. Up close, Victoria Sterling was devastating. Sharp cheekbones, eyes the color of a winter storm, and a jaw set with absolute unforgiving iron. There was no gratitude in her gaze, only calculation. "Are you hit?" Elias asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "I am perfectly intact," Victoria replied coldly. She didn't lower the rifle. Instead, she turned her fierce gaze to the trembling preacher behind the altar. "Reverend, you may proceed." The preacher peeked over the wood, his face pale. "My lady, the church is in ruins. There are men dead." "I don't care if the devil himself is sitting in the front row, Reverend," Victoria snapped. "Silas Vance will have a territorial judge here by sundown to seize my land because a widow cannot hold the deed. By the time that judge arrives, I will be a married woman. Read the vows." Elias stared at her. She wasn't looking for a savior. She was executing a legal maneuver. He stepped up beside her, smelling the lavender soap on her skin mixed with the sharp tang of gunpowder. The vows were read in a terrified rush. There were no rings. There was no kiss. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Victoria finally lowered the Winchester. She didn't toss a bouquet. She ejected a spent brass shell casing onto the ruined floor of the church, looked Elias dead in the eye, and said, "Get on a horse, Mr. Thorne, or start digging your grave." Victoria Sterling had survived the betrayal of the English courts, the death of a husband, and the brutal winters of the frontier. She was not about to lose her empire to a greedy railroad tycoon like Silas Vance, and she certainly wasn't going to lose her absolute authority to a drifter with a fast gun. She sat behind the massive mahogany desk in her study, the warmth of the roaring fireplace doing nothing to thaw the ice in her veins. Across from her stood her new husband. Elias Thorne looked entirely out of place in the opulent room. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and coated in a layer of trail dust. His jaw was covered in dark stubble, and his eyes, a striking, dangerous shade of hazel, took in the room with the quiet assessment of a predator. Victoria slid a thick, leather-bound document across the desk. "The terms of our arrangement," she said, her tone purely transactional. "You will be provided a monthly stipend, a horse of your choosing, and the guest suite in the East Wing. In exchange, you act as the legal co-owner of the Sterling Ranch on paper only. You have no voting rights, no authority over my foreman, and no access to the ledgers. You are a shield, Mr. Thorne. Do you understand?" Elias didn't even glance at the paper. He looked at her, really looked at her, in a way that made the fine hairs on the back of Victoria's neck stand up. "I didn't ride 1,000 miles for your money, Lady Sterling," he said quietly. He reached into his coat, pulled out a charcoal pencil, and signed his name at the bottom of the page with quick, aggressive strokes. He tossed the pencil onto the desk. "And I don't sleep on velvet. I'll take a bunk with the men." Victoria bristled. "The men will not respect a master who sleeps in the dirt with them." "They won't respect a master who hides behind a woman's silk curtains either," Elias shot back softly. He tipped his hat. "Evening, my lady." He was gone before she could issue a reprimand. By dawn the next morning, the Montana sky had broken open, unleashing a torrential, freezing spring rain. Victoria stood on the covered balcony of her bedroom, a hot cup of tea warming her hands, looking out over the sprawling, muddy expanse of the breaking corrals. She expected Elias to be sleeping off his ride. Instead, he was standing in the center of the deepest mud, facing a massive, wild-roan stallion that had already broken the collarbone of two of her best hands. Her foreman, Gideon, stood by the fence with a dozen ranch hands shouting over the rain, offering Elias a heavy leather whip. Elias shook his head. He tossed his hat to the fence post and stepped deeper into the corral. Victoria held her breath. The roan reared up, hooves slashing the air, screaming a challenge. Any other man would have lashed out, tried to beat the beast into submission. Elias didn't flinch. He stood perfectly still in the driving rain, his hands open and lowered at his sides. He spoke to the horse, his voice lost to the storm, but his posture radiating an unshakable, quiet dominance. For 20 agonizing minutes it was a dance of wills. The stallion charged. Elias held his ground, stepping aside at the last possible second, never raising a hand in anger, never showing fear. He demanded respect, not through violence, but through absolute, immovable strength. Slowly, incredibly, the wild roan stopped fighting. The massive beast lowered its head, chest heaving, and took a hesitant step toward the man in the mud. Elias raised a hand, slick with rain, and rested it firmly on the stallion's neck. The horse let out a long breath and submitted. A cheer erupted from the hardened ranch hands at the fence. They weren't looking at a paper husband anymore. They were looking at a leader. Up on the balcony, Victoria realized she was gripping her teacup so tightly, her fingers ached. She watched as Elias grabbed the horse's mane and swung himself smoothly onto the bare back of the beast. As he rode out of the corral, Elias stopped. He didn't look at the cheering men. He looked up, straight through the driving rain, directly at her balcony. He calmed the beast, tipped his muddy Stetson to the woman watching him, and rode away. Victoria's knuckles turned white on the railing. The cold, calculating assessment in her chest had vanished, replaced by a sudden, terrifying heat. The game had just changed. The bunkhouse smelled of stale tobacco, damp wool, and the honest sweat of hard labor. For Elias Thorne, it smelled like the only kind of home he had ever known. It had been a week since the wedding that ended in gunfire, a week since he had signed his life over to a woman whose eyes were as cold and sharp as cracked winter ice. True to his word, Elias hadn't set foot inside the opulent walls of the Sterling Manor since the day he signed the contract. He took his meals with the ranch hands, slept on a lumpy mattress in the corner of the bunkhouse, and worked from the moment the sun bruised the horizon until the stars punched holes in the pitch-black sky. He didn't talk much, he didn't have to. The men had seen him break the roan stallion, and out here in the Montana Territory, a man's actions spoke a hell of a lot louder than his pedigree. Gideon Cross, Victoria's scarred, fiercely loyal foreman, was the only one who still watched Elias with a measured, calculating suspicion. Gideon was a man who had earned his position through blood and unbreakable loyalty to Lady Sterling, and he wasn't about to hand his trust over to a drifter just because a piece of paper said they were technically co-owners. It was 3 in the morning when the unnatural stillness of the night shattered. Elias was a light sleeper, a habit formed by years of sleeping with one eye open on the trail. He didn't hear a shout, nor did he hear a gunshot. What woke him was a vibration deep in the floorboards, a low, rhythmic thrumming that rattled the tin cups on the wooden table. Hoofbeats, not horses, hundreds of them. Elias threw off his wool blanket, his bare feet hitting the cold floorboards. He grabbed his Colt from the nightstand, checking the cylinder by pure muscle memory as he shoved his legs into his denim trousers. "Gideon!" Elias barked, his voice cutting through the snores of the exhausted men. The foreman was up in a second, a Winchester already in his hands. "What is it?" "Listen," Elias said grimly, pulling on his boots. Gideon froze, his head tilted toward the open window. The low thrumming was growing louder, transforming into a terrifying, thunderous roar. The earth itself seemed to be groaning. "The north pasture," Gideon swore, his face draining of color in the moonlight. "The main herd. Someone spooked 'em. They're running straight for the Devil's Drop." Devil's Drop was a jagged limestone bluff that plunged 200 feet into a dry riverbed. If the herd went over the edge, Victoria Sterling's empire would be crippled overnight. Silas Vance wouldn't need a judge to take her land. Bankruptcy would do the job for him. "Saddle up," Gideon roared, kicking the nearest bunk. "Every man on a horse right damn now." The bunkhouse exploded into frantic, organized chaos. Men grabbed rifles, slickers, and boots, spilling out into the freezing night air. Elias didn't wait for the rest. He sprinted to the corrals, throwing a saddle onto his black gelding with brutal efficiency, yanking the latigo tight. He swung into the saddle, digging his heels into the horse's flanks. The gelding exploded forward, tearing across the open ground toward the north pasture. Gideon was right beside him on a massive gray mare, his jaw set like granite. As they crested the first ridge, the sheer scale of the nightmare revealed itself. Under the pale, ghostly light of a half-moon, 3,000 head of cattle were moving as one massive, terrified organism. The noise was deafening, a chaotic symphony of bellowing beasts, clashing horns, and the catastrophic drumming of 12,000 hooves tearing the prairie to shreds. A thick, choking cloud of dust rose into the night sky, obscuring the stars. Through the haze, Elias saw the flashes of muzzle fire. "There!" Elias shouted, pointing through the dust. "Vance's riders. They're firing into the air, driving the herd from behind." "We can't shoot back without spooking the herd worse," Gideon yelled over the din. "We have to turn the leaders. We have to bend the herd away from the bluff." It was a suicide mission. Riding to the front of a stampede meant placing yourself directly in the path of a meat grinder. If a horse stumbled, if a rider fell, there would be nothing left of them but a bloody stain in the dirt. Elias didn't hesitate. He spurred his gelding, plunging down the ridge and into the choking, suffocating cloud of dust. The heat of the herd was oppressive, rolling over him in waves of panic and sweat. Elias rode parallel to the terrifying mass of muscle and horn, pushing his horse to its absolute limit to reach the front. Gideon was flanking him, cracking a heavy bullwhip to push the outer cattle inward. "Yeah, turn, you bastards!" Elias roared, firing his colt into the dirt directly in front of the lead steers. The blinding flash and the spray of dirt made the massive, white-faced Hereford leader hesitate. Elias pushed harder, riding dangerously close, his knee brushing against the steer's heaving flank. He fired again, shouting until his throat was raw. Slowly, agonizingly, the lead steer began to veer to the right, away from the treacherous edge of Devil's Drop. Where the leader went, the herd followed. The massive organism began to arc, the thunderous momentum shifting back toward the open plains. They were going to make it. They were going to turn them. Through the swirling dust, Elias caught a glimpse of movement to his left. A lone rider had broken away from the rear of the herd and was galloping hard along the flank. It was one of Vance's thugs, a bandana pulled up over his nose. The man wasn't aiming at the cattle anymore. He had leveled a repeating rifle directly at Gideon's back. Gideon was entirely focused on the herd, oblivious to the lethal threat bearing down on him. Time seemed to fracture, slowing down to a crawl. Elias couldn't shout over the deafening roar of the stampede. He couldn't get a clean shot with his colt. The distance was too far, the dust too thick, and his horse was moving too fast. Elias did the only thing he could do. He violently yanked the reins, driving his black gelding hard to the left, putting himself directly in the line of fire. The rifle cracked. Elias felt the impact before he heard the bullet. It was like being struck by a red-hot iron rod across his ribs. The sheer force of the blow nearly knocked him out of the saddle, the breath exploding from his lungs in a ragged gasp. He swayed dangerously, his vision flashing pure white, his left hand instinctively clamping down on the saddle horn to keep from falling beneath the churning hooves. But he didn't fall. Through the haze of pain, Elias raised his colt. His arm felt like lead, his breathing shallow and agonizing, but his aim was dead center. He squeezed the trigger. The thug jerked backward, his rifle flying into the dirt, before he slumped forward over his horse's neck and galloped away into the darkness. The herd finally turned, their momentum bleeding out into the vast, open valley. The stampede was over. Elias pulled back on the reins, his gelding coming to a shuddering halt. The world was spinning. He looked down. The side of his shirt was soaked in something dark and wet that looked black in the moonlight. "Thorn!" Gideon's voice cut through the ringing in Elias's ears. The foreman rode up, his face smeared with dirt, his eyes wide as he saw Elias slumped in the saddle. "Christ almighty, you're hit." "Just a scratch," Elias rasped, his voice tight. He tried to sit up straight, but the world tilted violently. Did we lose any?" "A few stragglers went over the edge," Gideon said, his voice thick with an emotion Elias hadn't heard from him before. "But you saved the herd, and you saved me. You saved—" "I saw that rider, Thorn. I saw what you did." "Don't mention it," Elias muttered, before his vision finally faded to black. When Elias opened his eyes, the first thing he registered was the smell. It wasn't the scent of hay, sweat, and manure that he was accustomed to. It was beeswax, polished wood, and lavender. He was lying on a plush velvet sofa. A crystal chandelier cast a warm golden glow across the room. He was in the Manor's parlor. A sharp, searing pain tore through his side, making him groan and clench his jaw. "Hold still, damn you." The voice was crisp, authoritative, and impossibly close. Elias blinked, his vision clearing. Lady Victoria Sterling was sitting on the edge of the sofa beside him. She had discarded her usual tailored riding jacket. She wore only a crisp white silk blouse, the sleeves rolled up past her elbows. Her dark hair was pinned up, but a few loose strands framed a face that was pale and tense. Elias looked down. His shirt had been cut away. A basin of bloody water sat on the floor, next to a bottle of whiskey. Victoria was leaning over him, holding a curved needle threaded with black silk. "You shouldn't be doing that," Elias murmured, his voice gravelly. "Where's the doc?" "The doctor is in town an hour's ride away," Victoria replied, her eyes focused entirely on his torn flesh. "And you were bleeding all over my imported Persian rug. So you will lie still and let me finish, or I will pour this entire bottle of iodine into the wound and see how tough you truly are." Elias managed a weak smirk. "Yes, ma'am." He watched her as she worked. Her hands were small, elegant, entirely unsuited for the brutal reality of the frontier. Yet they were impeccably steady. She cleaned the grazing bullet wound with ruthless efficiency, her face a mask of absolute concentration. But Elias was observant. He noticed the way her jaw trembled ever so slightly when the needle pierced his skin. He noticed the way her breathing was too fast, too shallow. He noticed the stark, undeniable contrast of his own dirt-stained, calloused skin against her pale, aristocratic hands. "Gideon told me what happened," Victoria said softly, the silence between them growing heavy. She didn't look up from the stitches. "He said Vance's men tried to push the herd over Devil's Drop. He said you turned them. We turned them. Gideon knows his business. He also said you threw your horse in the path of a rifle barrel to save his life." Victoria finally tied off the final stitch and snipped the thread with a small pair of silver scissors. She reached for a clean linen bandage, her fingers accidentally brushing against the hard, scarred planes of his chest. She flinched, pulling her hand back as if she had been burned. Elias caught her wrist. His grip was weak, but firm enough to stop her. Victoria's gaze snapped up to meet his. For the first time since he had met her in that bullet-riddled church, the ice in her eyes had melted. What replaced it was a storm of conflicting emotions, anger, confusion, and a raw, terrifying vulnerability. "Why did you do it, Elias?" she whispered, her voice stripped of its usual haughty command. "You had a contract. You were supposed to be a legal fiction. You weren't supposed to bleed for this place. You weren't supposed to bleed for me." Elias didn't let go of her wrist. The heat radiating between them was suddenly far more dangerous than the fever settling into his blood. "I don't sign my name to fictions, Victoria," Elias said softly, holding her stormy gaze. "And I protect what's mine." Victoria stared at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly. For a split second, Elias thought she might lean in. He thought he saw the desperate human need hiding behind the iron mask of the Baroness. Instead, she gently but firmly pulled her wrist from his grasp. She stood up, her posture instantly reverting to rigid perfection, though her hands still shook as she wiped the blood from them with a towel. "Rest, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice brittle. "You've earned your keep for the month." She turned and walked out of the parlor, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. But Elias saw it. As she closed the heavy oak doors behind her, he saw the way she leaned heavily against the wood, pressing her hand over her heart. The fortress hadn't fallen, but the first stone had just cracked. 3 weeks had passed since the night of the stampede. The bullet graze along Elias's ribs had healed into a tight, angry pink scar, but his temper was wearing considerably thinner. Victoria Sterling was avoiding him. She managed the ranch with the precision of a military general, issuing orders through Gideon, reviewing ledgers locked in her study, and maintaining a schedule that ensured she and Elias rarely crossed paths. It was a tactical retreat. She had shown a moment of weakness in the parlor, a flicker of humanity, and she was punishing them both for it by rebuilding the ice wall twice as thick. Elias didn't push. He respected the boundaries she drew, spending his days mending fences, branding calves, and learning every square inch of the vast Sterling empire. But he watched her. He watched the way the sunlight caught the severe lines of her profile when she rode out on her chestnut mare. He watched the heavy burden of command she carried on her slender shoulders. He was beginning to understand that Lady Victoria Sterling wasn't cold because she lacked a heart. She was cold because if she ever let herself feel the weight of what she carried, it would crush her. "I'm riding up to the northern boundary this morning," Victoria announced at breakfast, addressing Gideon, ignoring Elias entirely as she sipped her black coffee. "Vance has been quiet since the stampede, too quiet. I want to inspect the fencing near the ridgeline myself." With respect, my lady, the barometer is dropping fast, Gideon warned, glancing out the window at the bruised, leaden sky. The air tastes like snow. Spring blizzards up here come on quick and they don't take prisoners. Let me send a couple of the boys instead. I do not delegate my responsibilities, Gideon, Victoria said firmly, standing up and smoothing her heavy wool riding skirt. I will be back before noon. You aren't going alone, Elias said. It was the first time he had spoken directly to her in days. His voice was low, carrying that quiet, immovable authority that had won over the bunkhouse. He remained seated, his hands wrapped around a tin mug, but his hazel eyes were locked onto hers. Victoria stiffened, her chin lifting defiantly. I know this land better than you do, Mr. Thorne. I do not require an escort. Didn't ask if you required one, Elias replied smoothly, standing up. He grabbed his heavy canvas duster and his rifle from the hook by the door. I'm coming with you. If the weather holds, you get to ignore me for 3 hours. If it doesn't, you'll be glad I'm there to dig you out. For a moment it looked like she might argue, but she saw the stubborn set of his jaw and recognized a battle she couldn't win without causing a scene in front of the foreman. She gave a sharp, irritated sigh. Try to keep up then, she snapped, sweeping out the door. The ride north was spectacularly beautiful and chillingly silent. The Montana landscape was vast and unforgiving, a sprawling canvas of pine-covered foothills and jagged granite peaks. They rode side by side, the only sounds the creak of saddle leather and the rhythmic thud of hooves against the hardening earth. Elias didn't mind the silence. He was used to the quiet, but he could feel the tension rolling off Victoria in waves. She sat rigidly in the saddle, her eyes scanning the horizon, her gloved hands gripping the reins tighter than necessary. By mid-morning, Gideon's warning proved entirely accurate. The temperature plummeted with terrifying speed. The bruised sky turned a solid, suffocating white, and the wind began to howl, sweeping down from the mountains like a physical blow. Within minutes, the air was thick with blinding, driving snow. It wasn't just a flurry. It was a whiteout. "We need to turn back," Victoria shouted, her voice barely audible over the shrieking wind. Ice was already clinging to her eyelashes, her chestnut mare dancing nervously beneath her. "Too far," Elias yelled back, pulling his bandana up over his nose. He squinted against the stinging snow, calculating their position. "We'll lose the trail in this. There's an old line cabin about a mile east of here near the creek. We make for that." Victoria didn't argue. Survival out here meant knowing when you were outmatched by nature. She nodded, trusting his sense of direction. They pushed the horses hard, fighting against the blinding wall of white. The cold was brutal, seeping through layers of wool and canvas, biting into their bones. By the time the dark silhouette of the dilapidated log cabin materialized out of the snow, Victoria was shaking violently, her lips tinged blue. Elias practically dragged her from the saddle, rushing her toward the heavy wooden door, while he tied the horses securely in the small, three-sided lean-to attached to the back of the cabin. He kicked the door open. The cabin was exactly what it was meant to be, a rough, desperate shelter. A pot-bellied stove sat in the corner, a dusty cot against the wall, and thankfully a small stack of dry, chopped wood stacked beneath a tarp. Elias didn't waste a second. He ushered Victoria inside, slammed the door against the howling wind, and immediately went to work on the stove. Within minutes, he had a small fire crackling, the blessed heat beginning to radiate through the freezing, cramped space. He turned around. Victoria was standing in the center of the room, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her teeth chattering so hard he could hear it over the storm. She looked small. Stripped of her manner, her guards, and her power, she was just a woman freezing to death. "Get your coat off," Elias ordered gently. "It's wet. It'll only pull the heat from you." For a moment, the aristocratic pride flared in her eyes. I am quite all right." "Victoria, take the damn coat off," Elias said, stepping closer. His use of her first name, stripped of titles and formalities, seemed to break the spell. Her numb fingers struggled with the heavy buttons of her riding jacket. Elias reached out, his large hands brushing hers away. He unbuttoned the soaked wool, peeling the heavy jacket off her shoulders, leaving her in a damp, high-collared white blouse and her riding skirt. He unbuckled his own heavy canvas duster, which had kept the snow out and his body heat in, and draped it firmly over her trembling shoulders. The coat dwarfed her, swallowing her in heavy canvas and the scent of leather, tobacco, and him. Victoria pulled the lapels tight around her neck, sinking down onto a rickety wooden chair by the stove. The firelight danced across her pale face, softening the severe lines, making her look younger, more vulnerable. Elias pulled a silver flask from his pocket, unscrewed the cap, and handed it to her. "Drink. It'll burn, but it'll warm your blood." She took it, her fingers brushing against his. She took a long swallow of the whiskey, coughing as the cheap, fiery liquid hit the back of her throat. She handed it back, a faint flush finally returning to her cheeks. They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the wind screaming against the log walls. The forced proximity was suffocating. The cabin was too small, the heat of the fire too intimate. Every time Elias shifted, the floorboards creaked. Every time Victoria breathed, the scent of lavender mixed with the wood smoke. "You think I'm a monster, don't you?" Her voice was quiet, almost entirely devoid of its usual icy edge. Elias looked at her, surprised. She was staring into the flames, the oversized duster making her look fragile. "I think you're a woman doing what she has to do to survive a world built by men." Victoria let out a bitter, breathless laugh. "My father was an earl," she began, her voice distant, as if she were speaking to the fire rather than to him. "I was raised in drawing rooms and ballrooms, taught to smile, to curtsy, to be a beautiful, silent ornament. When I was 19, my father lost the family fortune in a disastrous shipping venture." She took a shuddering breath, pulling Elias's coat tighter around her. "He sold me," she said flatly, "to a man 30 years my senior, a cruel, vicious man who needed a titled wife to legitimize his new money. My father signed the marriage contract, traded my life for his debts, and walked away. I belonged to that man. I had no rights, no voice, no money of my own. When he died, his creditors took everything, and I was left with nothing but the clothes on my back." Elias sat perfectly still, the pieces of the puzzle finally snapping into place. The ironclad contracts, the absolute refusal to share power, the desperate, ruthless grip on her land. "I came to America," Victoria continued, her voice trembling slightly, though her eyes remained dry. "I met Thomas Sterling. He was a good man. He treated me with respect, and together we built this ranch from the dirt up. When he died, I promised myself, I swore to God, that I would never, ever surrender control of my life to another human being. I will burn this valley to ash before I let Silas Vance or anyone else take what is mine." She finally looked at him. The mask was entirely gone. Her eyes were wide, luminous in the firelight, filled with a raw, agonizing fear that she had hidden from the world for years. "I can't be weak, Elias," she whispered. "If I show them a single crack, they will tear me apart." Elias felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with the bullet scar on his ribs. He understood her now. He saw the terrified, fiercely proud survivor beneath the silk and the ice. He stood up slowly so as not to spook her. He crossed the small space between them and knelt down in front of her chair, bringing himself lower than her, offering no threat, only absolute stillness. He reached out. He didn't grab her. He didn't pull her into his arms. He simply raised his hand and pressed the rough, calloused pad of his thumb gently against the line of her jaw. Her skin was incredibly soft, finely warm from the fire. Victoria gasped softly at the contact, her eyes fluttering shut for a fraction of a second, leaning infinitesimally into his touch. The tension between them was a physical, crackling thing. The air was heavy with the unspoken promise of a kiss, a desperate, fiery collision of two lonely souls trapped in the dark. But Elias held back. He knew that if he kissed her now, while she was vulnerable, while she was stripped bare and hiding in a storm, she would hate him for it tomorrow. She would see it as a conquest. "Listen to me," Elias whispered, his thumb lightly stroking her cheekbone, his voice an anchor in the storm. "You are the strongest woman I have ever known. But you don't have to carry the whole damn world by yourself." She opened her eyes, looking at him with an expression he couldn't name. It was a mix of desperate hope and profound fear. "I told you the day I signed that paper," Elias continued softly, his eyes locked on hers. "I didn't come here to take anything from you, Victoria. I came here to stand beside you." He let his hand drop, slowly severing the electric connection between them. He stood up, grabbing a spare piece of canvas from the corner. "I'm going to check on the horses," Elias said, his voice returning to its usual, gravelly calm. "Make sure the lean-to is holding up against the wind." He opened the heavy door, the brutal, shrieking whiteout immediately clawing at him. He stepped out, pulling the door shut with a heavy thud, leaving her alone in the quiet warmth of the cabin. Victoria sat by the fire, entirely wrapped in the heavy, comforting scent of Elias Thorne. She raised her hand, her fingertips trembling as she touched her own jawline where his thumb had been just moments before. She stared into the flames, the terrifying realization washing over her in the silence of the storm. The ruthless lady of the valley, the woman who trusted no one, realized that her strongest, most impenetrable fortress was starting to collapse. And God help her, she didn't want to stop it. The spring thaw arrived with a cruel, deceptive warmth, melting the blizzard snow into a sea of thick, sucking mud. But as the sun beat down on the Montana territory, a terrifying silence fell over the Sterling Ranch. Elias Thorne stood on the edge of the Sweetwater Creek, the lifeblood of the entire valley, his boots sinking into the damp earth. There was no rushing current. There was no roar of white water crashing over the smooth river stones. There was only a pathetic, muddy trickle, exposing the skeletal roots of the cottonwood trees and leaving trout flopping desperately in rapidly shrinking puddles. Gideon Cross rode up beside him, his gray mare lathered in sweat. The foreman's face was a mask of grim, suppressed fury. He dismounted, walking to the edge of the dry creek bed, his jaw working as he stared at the devastation. 10,000 head of cattle, Thorne, Gideon said, his voice raw. 10,000. In 4 days, the mud will bake into clay. In 6, the calves will start dropping. In a week, the whole damn herd will be dead of thirst. Elias crouched down, scooping a handful of the damp mud. He let it slip through his fingers, his eyes tracking the dry riverbed up toward the jagged peaks of the northern canyon. "Vance." "Yeah," Gideon spat, kicking a dry stone. "I sent 2 scouts up the gorge at first light. Vance has a crew of 50 men and 24 Pinkerton gunslingers camped just outside the property line. They've dammed the bottleneck, timber, earth, and stone. He's choking off the headwaters. Claims he's building a reservoir for the railroad, perfectly legal under the new Territorial Expansion Act." "Legal," Elias muttered, a dark, dangerous fire igniting in his chest. "A piece of paper doesn't make a man immune to a bullet." "Maybe. But a bullet brings the U.S. Marshals down on our heads. That's what Vance wants. He wants us to attack so he can claim self-defense and have the government seize the land." Elias stood up, wiping the mud from his hands onto his denim trousers. "Where is she?" "The armory," Gideon said, the color draining slightly from his scarred face. "And Thorne? She's not thinking like a businesswoman right now. She's thinking like a warlord." Elias didn't wait. He swung onto his black gelding and rode hard for the manor. When he pushed through the heavy double doors of the mansion, the air was thick with the sharp scent of gun oil and brass. He found Victoria in the windowless armory adjacent to her study. The room was a fortress, lined with racks of repeating rifles, shotguns, and boxes of ammunition. She stood in the center of the room, her dark hair pinned back ruthlessly, wearing a severe riding habit. Her hands, usually so elegant and poised, were rapidly loading .44-40 cartridges into the loading gate of a Winchester rifle. Her face was pale, her eyes burning with a feverish, volatile intensity Elias had never seen before. The Ice Queen had shattered, and beneath the ice was a raging inferno. "Gather the men," Victoria ordered without looking up as Elias stepped into the room. "Tell them to saddle every fresh horse. We ride for the canyon in 20 minutes. I want 50 rounds issued to every man." "No," Elias said quietly. Victoria froze. The metallic click of the rifle mechanism echoed loudly in the small room. She slowly raised her head, her storm-gray eyes locking onto his with absolute, lethal warning. "I beg your pardon?" "I said no." Elias took a step further into the room, his voice a low, steady rumble meant to ground a panicking animal. "You aren't sending 30 ranch hands into a fortified canyon against a heavily armed Pinkerton barricade in broad daylight. It's a slaughter. They have the high ground, Victoria. You'd be leading your men into a meat grinder." "I will not watch my herd die," Victoria shouted, the sudden explosion of volume startling in the confined space. She slammed the heavy rifle down onto the wooden table. "Do you understand what that water means? It is the blood in the veins of this ranch. Thomas and I bled into this dirt to build this empire, and I will not let a corrupt, bloated railroad tycoon steal it from me by parching my land." She stepped toward him, her chest heaving, her aristocratic composure entirely obliterated by desperation. "I am the master of this valley, Elias. I give the orders. Now step aside." Elias didn't move. He stood planted in the doorway, his broad shoulders practically filling the frame. Victoria marched right up to him, stopping inches from his chest. "Move, Thorne. That is an order." "I don't take orders that end with dead men," Elias said softly. Furious, Victoria shoved her hands against his chest, trying to physically move him. It was like trying to push a granite boulder. Elias didn't budge an inch. She shoved him again, a frustrated, breathless sound escaping her throat. "Move," she demanded, her voice cracking, her fists hitting his chest. "You are my husband on paper, not my warden. Let me pass." Elias caught her wrists. He didn't grip her hard enough to bruise, but his hold was immovable. He pulled her slightly closer, forcing her to look up at him, forcing her to meet his unwavering hazel eyes. "Victoria, stop," he commanded, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with a raw, fierce authority. She struggled for a second longer before the fight suddenly drained out of her. Her shoulders slumped, and she let out a ragged, uneven breath, her forehead dropping to rest against his chest. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to lean on him, her pulse racing wildly against his grip. "They'll die," she whispered into his shirt, the vulnerability she had shown in the line cabin returning, amplified by terror. "Everything we built, it will all turn to dust." Elias released her wrists, moving his hands up to grip her shoulders gently. He could feel the fine tremors shaking her slender frame. "You're acting like a cornered animal," Elias said softly, his thumbs brushing against her collarbones. "But you aren't an animal. You're a queen. So start thinking like one. If Vance wants a war, we give him one. But we fight on our terms, not in the daylight, not head-on." Victoria slowly lifted her head, stepping back just enough to look at his face. The blind panic in her eyes was beginning to recede, replaced by the sharp, calculating intelligence he admired so much. "What are you suggesting?" "A tactical strike," Elias said, his mind already mapping out the gorge. "Gideon was an engineer in the war, wasn't he? He knows how to handle blasting gelatin. We don't need 50 men to take a dam. We need the cover of darkness, 3 men, and enough dynamite to blow the timber supports to hell." Victoria's eyes narrowed as she processed the strategy. "A stealth raid. If you're caught, the Pinkertons will hang you before the sun comes up. Then we don't get caught." Elias let his hands drop from her shoulders. "Gideon, myself, and maybe 2 of the quietest hands we have. We slip in on foot through the ridge, plant the charges at the base, and blow the choke point. The water pressure will do the rest." Victoria stared at him, the silence in the armory stretching out, heavy with the weight of the gamble. It was a suicide mission, but it was a precise, calculated suicide mission. She turned back to the table, her hand resting on the polished walnut stock of her Winchester. 3 men, Victoria said quietly, her voice regaining its icy, authoritative edge. And 1 woman. Elias frowned. Victoria, no, it's too dangerous. The terrain is brutal in the dark, and if a firefight breaks out, do not insult me, Elias, she cut him off, turning to face him. The desperation was gone, replaced by absolute unyielding iron. This is my land. This is my fight. I can shoot the wings off a fly at 100 yards in the dark, and you know it. I am not sitting in this manor waiting to hear if I am a widow twice over. I am coming with you. Elias looked at her. He saw the fire, the pride, and the unbreakable will of the woman who had survived everything the world had thrown at her. He realized then that trying to keep her safe in a cage, even a gilded one, would destroy her soul faster than any bullet. He gave a slow, respectful nod. He wasn't treating her like a fragile lady. He was treating her like a partner. We leave the horses a mile down the canyon, Elias said, his voice deadly serious. We move in silence. If shooting starts, you follow my lead. Understood? Understood, she replied, her chin lifting. Get your gear ready, Elias said, turning toward the door. Elias, she called out, stopping him in the frame. He looked back. Thank you, she said softly. It wasn't just gratitude for the plan. It was gratitude for seeing her, for not treating her like a hysterical widow. Elias touched the brim of his hat and walked out to find Gideon. Midnight draped the Montana territory in absolute suffocating darkness. The moon was nothing but a cruel silver sliver hidden behind thick, fast-moving clouds. Elias stood by the corral, his black duster sweeping the mud, checking the cylinder of his Colt by touch. Gideon was securing a canvas satchel filled with tightly bound sticks of dynamite and coils of fuse wire to his saddle horn. 2 other men, Garrett and Pine, both silent and lethal, were tightening their cinches. The heavy double doors of the manor opened. Elias looked up. Victoria stepped out onto the porch and the breath caught in his throat. She wasn't wearing a silk blouse or a restrictive riding habit. She wore a pair of men's dark denim trousers tucked into knee-high leather riding boots. A tailored black leather duster fell to her calves, tailored perfectly to her waist, giving her the silhouette of an avenging angel. Her hair was tightly braided down her back, out of the way, and she held her Winchester lever-action rifle across her chest with practiced ease. She looked terrifying. She looked magnificent. She walked down the steps, her boots quiet in the mud, and stopped in front of Elias. She racked the lever of the Winchester, chambering around with a sharp metallic clack that echoed in the quiet night. She looked up at him, her storm-gray eyes flashing with a deadly, thrilling promise. We ride at midnight, Thorn, Victoria said, her voice a velvet threat. Together. The canyon was a jagged scar cut deep into the earth, lined with towering pines and treacherous, loose shale. The roar of the wind whipping through the gorge masked the sound of their approach. They left the horses tied in a thick grove of aspens a mile downriver from the dam. From here they moved on foot. Elias took the lead, his boots finding silent purchase on the damp rocks. His senses were dialed to an agonizing peak. Every snapped twig, every rustle of the wind sounded like a gunshot to his strained nerves. The dull ache in his ribs from the bullet graze weeks ago was a constant throbbing reminder of his mortality, but he pushed the pain down into a dark corner of his mind. Behind him, Victoria moved like a ghost. For all her aristocratic upbringing, she possessed an innate, lethal grace. She didn't stumble. She didn't hesitate. She kept her rifle lowered but ready, her eyes constantly scanning the ridgeline. Gideon and the 2 hands brought up the rear, hauling the heavy satchels of explosives. As they rounded a sharp bend in the canyon, the glow of campfires painted the canyon walls in flickering shades of orange and blood red. Vance's dam was a monstrous abomination of nature. Massive timber logs, stripped from the surrounding forest, had been driven deep into the riverbed, reinforced by tons of earth and stone. Behind it, a massive, unnatural lake was forming, drowning the upper valley in stagnant black water. A dozen tents were pitched on the high ground above the dam. Pinkerton guards and hired thugs patrolled the perimeter, rifles slung lazily over their shoulders, smoking cigarettes and laughing over the crackle of the fires. Elias crouched behind an outcropping of limestone, gesturing for the others to get low. "There are too many on the east ridge," Elias whispered, his mouth practically against Victoria's ear so the wind wouldn't carry his voice. The scent of her lavender soap mixed dizzyingly with the smell of wet earth. "Gideon and I need to get to the base of the timber supports right in the center. We need a distraction, and we need overwatch." Victoria nodded, her eyes narrowed as she analyzed the camp. Garrett and Pine can circle wide to the west. If they start a brush fire near the supply wagons, it will draw the bulk of the guards away from the dam. I will take the high ground here. She tapped the limestone rock. I have a clear line of sight on the bridge spanning the top of the timber. If anyone looks down at you, I will take them out. Elias hesitated. Leaving her alone on the ridge went against every protective instinct in his body. But he looked into her eyes and saw the absolute cold competence of a woman who had survived by her own wits. "2 shots, Elias said grimly. "If you fire twice, we abort. We drop the charges and run. Promise me." "I don't make promises I can't keep, Elias," she whispered back. "Just plant the dynamite." Elias signaled Gideon. They waited agonizing minutes as Garrett and Pine slipped away into the shadows toward the western edge of the camp. Elias and Gideon began their descent. They slid down the steep, muddy embankment, moving from shadow to shadow until they reached the base of the massive timber wall. The sound of the water groaning against the wood was immense, a terrifying, creaking pressure just waiting to be unleashed. Up on the ridge, a sudden shout shattered the night. "Fire! The wagons are burning!" Chaos erupted in Vance's camp. Pinkerton scrambled out of their tents, grabbing buckets and shouting orders as a massive wall of orange flame suddenly illuminated the western tree line. Footsteps pounded across the wooden planks at the top of the dam as guards rushed to aid the fire effort. "Now!" Elias hissed. Gideon pulled the bundles of blasting gelatin from his satchel, shoving them deep into the crevices between the main load-bearing timbers. Elias worked beside him, his hands covered in mud and pitch, unspooling the waterproof fuse wire. "Need 3 minutes for a clean burn," Gideon muttered, his teeth clenched as he wedged the last bundle into place. Crack! The sharp, unmistakable report of a Winchester rifle echoed through the canyon, entirely distinct from the shouting of the camp. Elias's head snapped up. On the wooden walkway 40 feet above them, a Pinkerton guard who had happened to look down at the base of the dam collapsed forward, a neat hole through his chest, tumbling over the edge and splashing into the shallow mud near Elias's boots. Victoria had their backs, but the gunshot had given them away. "They're down at the base! Saboteurs!" a voice screamed from above. Suddenly, the wooden walkway at the top of the dam was swarming with men. Rifles flared in the darkness, raining lead down on Elias and Gideon. "Light it!" Elias roared, drawing his Colt and firing upward, providing covering fire. Bullets chewed into the mud and splintered the timber all around them. A piece of shrapnel sliced Elias's cheek, hot blood instantly mixing with the freezing rain. Gideon struck a match against the heel of his boot, shielding the flame with his body, and touched it to the fuse. It hissed, sparking with a brilliant, angry white light. "It's lit! Run!" Gideon shouted. They scrambled up the slick, muddy embankment, slipping and sliding as a hail of gunfire tore up the earth around their boots. Elias fired until his Colt clicked empty, holstering it on the run. He looked up toward the limestone outcropping where he had left Victoria. The firelight from the burning wagons illuminated her position. She was standing tall, the heavy duster whipping around her legs, working the lever of her Winchester with terrifying speed, laying down a devastating barrage of suppressing fire that forced the Pinkertons on the dam to keep their heads down. She was a Valkyrie in the smoke, a goddess of war protecting her kingdom, but she was entirely focused on the men on the dam. She didn't see the danger creeping up her flank. Elias's heart stopped. Through the smoke, he saw the silhouette of a man moving along the ridge to Victoria's right. It was a sniper, a hired gun who had flanked her position while the camp was in chaos. The man dropped to one knee, raising a Sharps rifle, the long barrel aiming directly at Victoria's back. Elias was 50 yards away. The mud was too thick. He couldn't reload his Colt in time. He couldn't shout over the deafening roar of the gunfire. There was no time to think. There was only the sudden, absolute certainty that he would not let her die. Elias didn't run toward cover. He lunged directly into the open, scrambling up the steep embankment toward the limestone rock with a burst of frantic, superhuman speed, his boots tearing the earth apart. Victoria turned, sensing the movement, her eyes widening as she saw Elias sprinting directly toward her, his face a mask of pure terror. "Elias!" she screamed, confused. Elias hit the crest of the ridge just as the sniper pulled the trigger. He threw his entire body weight forward, tackling Victoria to the ground. The heavy .50 caliber bullet from the Sharps rifle didn't miss. It found Elias with a sickening, wet thud. The impact lifted Elias off his feet, spinning him violently in the air before he crashed into the mud beside Victoria. The bullet had ripped through the back of his right shoulder, shattering the collarbone and exiting through the front of his duster in a spray of crimson. "Elias!" Victoria shrieked, the sound tearing from her throat, raw and agonizing. A split second later, the canyon erupted in a blinding flash of white light. The dynamite detonated. The shockwave hit them like a physical wall, knocking the breath from their lungs and deafening them instantly. The massive timber supports of the dam vaporized into a million deadly splinters. For a moment, there was a terrible suspended silence as the earth shuddered. And then the water came. With a roar that rivaled the end of the world, millions of gallons of captive black water shattered the remaining earthen walls. A 30-foot tidal wave of mud, stone, and raging current crashed down the canyon, sweeping away the Pinkerton camp, the burning wagons, and everything in its path. The spray from the deluge washed over the ridge, soaking Victoria and Elias in freezing water. The roar of the rushing river filled the night, the sweet, beautiful sound of the valley's lifeblood returning. But Victoria didn't care about the water. She didn't care about the empire. She scrambled through the mud on her hands and knees, dropping her rifle, her breath coming in ragged, hysterical sobs. Elias was lying on his back, his face chalk white in the moonlight. Blood, so much blood, was pooling beneath him, staining the mud black. His eyes were half open, glazed with shock, his chest rising in shallow, rattling gasps. "No, no, no, Elias, look at me," Victoria cried, falling to her knees beside him. She ripped her leather gloves off with her teeth, pressing her bare hands frantically against the massive, gaping exit wound on his chest, trying desperately to stem the torrential flow of blood. The hot, sticky reality of his life slipping through her fingers shattered the last remaining wall around her heart. "Look at me," she screamed, tears streaming down her face, mixing with the mud and rain. The cold, aristocratic Lady Sterling was gone, replaced by a desperate, terrified woman, holding the man she realized, too late, she couldn't live without. "You promised me! You promised you came here to stand beside me! You don't get to die, Elias Thorne! I forbid it! I forbid it!" Elias's lips moved. His bloody hand twitched, his fingers weakly finding the lapel of her soaked duster. He looked up at her, a faint, agonizing smile touching his lips. Your water," he rasped, coughing, a trickle of blood escaping the corner of his mouth. "It's back." His eyes rolled back, his hand falling limply into the mud. "Elias!" Victoria screamed into the roaring night, a sound of absolute, soul-shattering devastation that echoed down the canyon, drowning out the sound of the rushing river. She buried her face in his neck, sobbing uncontrollably, her hands stained red with the blood of the man who had traded his life for hers. The ride back to the Sterling Manor was a fragmented nightmare of blood, rain, and the agonizingly slow churn of wagon wheels through deep mud. Victoria did not remember how they had managed to drag Elias from the ridge. She only remembered the terrifying dead weight of his body, the slick warmth of his blood coating her hands. and the raw, guttural curses Gideon had spat into the darkness as they hoisted him into the back of a supply wagon commandeered from the flooded Pinkerton camp. Now, hours later, the storm had broken, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence over the valley. Elias lay in the center of Victoria's own massive four-poster bed in the master suite. She hadn't let Gideon take him to the guest wing, and she certainly hadn't let them take him to the bunkhouse. The town doctor, a grizzled old man named Harland, had been dragged from his bed at gunpoint by one of the ranch hands. He had spent 2 grueling hours digging the shattered fragments of the .50 caliber Sharps bullet out of Elias's right shoulder. The slug had miraculously missed his lung by a fraction of an inch, but it had pulverized the collarbone and torn through major muscle. "He's lost a staggering amount of blood, Lady Sterling," Dr. Harland had whispered, wiping his crimson-stained hands on a towel. "The wound is clean, and I've stitched the muscle as best I can, but the fever is already setting in. If he survives the night without the infection taking his heart, it will be a miracle of sheer, stubborn will." Now the doctor was gone, and the manor was eerily quiet. Victoria sat in a high-backed armchair beside the bed. She had stripped off her mud-caked duster and boots, wearing only her stained white blouse and trousers. Her hands were still faintly stained with his blood, despite how fiercely she had scrubbed them with lye soap. Elias's chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged intervals. His skin was pale, sheened with a feverish sweat that plastered his dark hair to his forehead. His broad chest, wrapped tightly in stark white linen bandages, looked painfully vulnerable. A tremor racked his body, a low groan vibrating in his throat as the fever spiked. Victoria moved instantly. She leaned over him, dipping a clean cloth into a basin of cool water, and gently pressed it against his burning forehead. "Stay with me, Elias," she whispered, her voice cracking in the quiet room. "You don't get to leave me. Not after this. Do you hear me?" He didn't answer. He just breathed, fighting a war entirely within his own blood. Victoria needed to do something. Sitting here, watching him hover on the precipice of death, was driving her mad. She turned away from the bed and noticed his ruined canvas duster and blood-soaked shirt piled on the floor near the hearth. She needed to clean the room. She needed order. She knelt by the pile of ruined clothes, picking up the heavy canvas duster. As she lifted it, something clattered heavily against the hardwood floor. Victoria frowned. She reached into the inside pocket of the coat, expecting to find extra cartridges or perhaps a tin of tobacco. Instead, her fingers brushed against a thick, braided leather cord. She pulled it out. Dangling from the end of the cord was a heavy, blackened iron key. Victoria stared at it, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't a standard door key, nor was it the key to a padlock. It had a unique, intricate, double-warded bit, forged with a distinct hexagonal head. She knew this key. Her heart began to pound a frantic, erratic rhythm against her ribs. She stood up, her eyes darting from the key in her hand to Elias's unconscious face. He had worn this around his neck, hidden. Without thinking, Victoria left the bedroom, hurrying down the dimly lit hallway and sweeping down the grand staircase toward her late husband's study. The house was silent save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. She pushed open the heavy oak doors of the study. The room smelled of old leather, cigar smoke, and memories. She walked past the massive mahogany desk, heading straight for the back wall. She reached up and pulled aside a heavy oil painting of the Montana landscape, revealing a massive iron-cast Mosler safe embedded into the stone chimney breast. Victoria knew the combination. Thomas had given it to her years ago. She spun the heavy brass dial, left 30, right 12, left 45, and pulled the heavy lever. The safe groaned open. Inside were the ledgers, the deeds, the operational cash for the ranch. But Victoria ignored all of it. She reached to the very back of the safe, running her fingers along the cold iron wall until she found a small, almost invisible seam. It was an interior lockbox, a hidden compartment Thomas had never mentioned, but one she had discovered by accident shortly after his death. She had spent months bringing locksmiths from as far as Denver to open it, but the mechanism was too complex and drilling it would have triggered a localized explosive safeguard meant to destroy the contents. She had eventually given up, assuming it held nothing but old, irrelevant keepsakes. Her hands trembled as she raised the heavy iron key Elias had carried. She slid it into the hidden keyhole. It fit perfectly. Victoria turned her wrist. With a heavy, satisfying clack, the interior lock disengaged. She pulled the small iron door open. A cloud of dust drifted out into the study. Inside the compartment was a single thick bundle of parchment, bound tightly with a faded red ribbon. Victoria pulled the bundle out. Her hands were shaking so violently she nearly dropped it. She carried the papers to the mahogany desk, turned up the wick on the kerosene lamp, and untied the ribbon. The handwriting was unmistakably Thomas's, but it wasn't a ledger. It was a series of letters and legally binding territorial contracts dated 22 years ago, long before Victoria had ever set foot in America, long before the Sterling Empire existed. She unfolded the first letter, the parchment dry and brittle under her fingertips. To my brother in arms, John Thorne. Victoria's breath hitched. John Thorne, Elias's father. The gold you sent arrived safely by armored coach, with the $50,000. I have successfully purchased the deeds to the Sweetwater Valley and the surrounding foothills from the territorial government. As we agreed, the deeds will remain in my name. The law here is unforgiving to a man with your past, and if the Union Army knew you survived the war, they would hang you and seize the land before the ink was dry. Victoria sank into the leather chair, her eyes wide as she read the words over and over again. $50,000. In 1860, that was a staggering fortune. It was the seed money for the entire empire. She continued to read, her heart hammering against her ribs. I will build the ranch, John. I will front the operation, and I will grow this valley into an empire. But we both know the truth. Half of this dirt belongs to you. It is yours by right, paid for in blood and gold. I have drafted the enclosed addendums to my will. Should I pass, the debt must be paid to your bloodline. If the day comes when your boy Elias rides into this valley, he is to be given his rightful half of the Sterling Empire. I swear this on my life and on the lives of anyone who comes after me. Your friend, Thomas Sterling. Victoria dropped the letter onto the desk. The silence in the study was deafening. The room spun. The absolute certainty of her entire existence was crumbling to dust around her. Thomas Sterling, the man who had rescued her from destitution, the man she had built this empire alongside, had never owned it completely. The dying wish, the blood debt. Victoria pressed her hands to her mouth, a choked gasp escaping her lips. When Elias's father sent that letter demanding she marry his son, it wasn't to collect a debt. It was a brilliantly orchestrated, ironclad legal maneuver. A widow could not hold land without a relentless legal battle. But if she married the true heir, if she married Elias, the two halves of the empire would merge seamlessly. Elias Thorne was not a penniless drifter. He was not a hired gun. He was not a shield. He was the absolute legal co-owner of the Sterling Ranch. And not just on paper, by blood, by right. Victoria stood up, her mind racing with a terrifying, paralyzing fear. If Elias knew about this, if he had the key, why hadn't he used it? He had signed a contract relinquishing all his rights to her. He had slept in the dirt with the ranch hands. He had taken a bullet to protect her land, his land. He could have walked into this study on his first day, unlocked the safe, and taken half of her empire. Any other man would have done exactly that. The aristocrats in Europe would have stripped her of her power with a smile. Silas Vance would have killed her for it. But Elias hadn't. He had asked for nothing. Victoria scooped up the bundle of letters and practically ran back up the stairs. She burst into the master bedroom. Elias was still exactly where she had left him, burning with fever, fighting for his next breath. She slowly approached the bed, clutching the 20-year-old parchment to her chest. She looked down at the rugged, scarred face of the man who had married her in a bullet-riddled church, the man who had thrown his horse in front of a rifle for her foreman, the man who had taken a .50 caliber bullet to save her life. The terrifying part wasn't that Elias had the legal right to take half of everything she owned. The terrifying part was that as she looked at him bleeding in her bed, Victoria realized she wanted to give him all of it. The fortress had fallen. The ice had melted. She didn't want to be the sole monarch of an empty empire anymore. She dropped to her knees beside the bed, burying her face in the blankets near his uninjured arm. For the first time in 10 years, Lady Victoria Sterling wept. "Don't die," she sobbed, her voice muffled by the thick wool. "Please, Elias, you win. You own me. You own all of it. Just open your eyes." Pain. It was a brilliant, blinding, white-hot agony that radiated from Elias's right shoulder, pulsing in time with the frantic, unsteady beat of his heart. He tried to draw a breath, but his chest felt like it was bound in iron bands. He forced his heavy eyelids open, half expecting to see the muddy, rain-slicked walls of the canyon or the rough timber ceiling of the bunkhouse. Instead, he saw intricate, hand-carved mahogany molding and the soft, flickering light of a crystal chandelier. He was in a bed so soft he felt like he was sinking into a cloud. The sheets smelled of fresh cotton and lavender. He tried to shift his weight, and a groan tore itself from his dry throat as the muscles in his back screamed in protest. "Don't move." The voice was soft, rough with exhaustion, but unmistakable. Elias turned his head slowly, fighting through the haze of narcotics and fever. Victoria was sitting in a chair pulled flush against the side of the bed. She looked wrecked. Her aristocratic perfection was entirely undone. Her dark hair was loose and tangled, falling over a simple white blouse. There were dark, bruised circles under her stormy eyes, and her complexion was pale as parchment. "Victoria," Elias rasped, his voice sounding like two stones grinding together. The dam is gone," she answered quietly. She poured a glass of water from a pitcher on the nightstand, supporting the back of his neck with a surprisingly gentle hand as she brought the rim to his cracked lips. "The water is flowing." Vance's camp was washed away. "You did it." Elias drank greedily, the cool water soothing his throat. He slumped back against the pillows, closing his eyes for a moment as the pain threatened to pull him under again. "Gideon?" "Safe. They're all safe." Victoria's voice wavered. "You're the only one who caught a bullet." Elias opened his eyes, looking at her. He could read the guilt radiating off her in waves. "I told you, I protect what's mine. You were in the crosshairs. I wasn't going to let that happen." Victoria stared at him, her eyes searching his face with a terrifying intensity. Slowly, she reached into her lap. She pulled out a thick bundle of yellowed parchment bound with a faded red ribbon. Resting on top of the letters was the heavy blackened iron key. Elias's breath hitched, the pain in his shoulder suddenly forgotten. "I was looking for bandages in your coat," Victoria said, her voice dropping to a trembling whisper. "I found the key." "I knew what lock it fit." Elias didn't speak. He couldn't. He looked at the letters that held the absolute truth of his legacy, the truth he had carried across 1,000 miles of dirt and dust. Victoria stood up, her hands shaking as she clutched the documents. The vulnerability she had shown a moment ago was suddenly warring with the fierce, defensive pride of the Lady of the Valley. She was bracing herself. She was preparing for the blow. "You knew," Victoria said, a tear finally escaping and cutting a clean path down her dusty cheek. "You knew before you ever rode into Mercer's Bend. Your father bought this land. Thomas was just a proxy. You didn't come here to act as a shield, Elias. You came here to claim your inheritance." "Victoria!" Elias tried to push himself up, but the agony pinned him back down. "Why didn't you say anything?" she demanded, her voice rising, fracturing with heartbreak and betrayal. "Why did you sign that contract? Why did you sleep in the dirt when you had the key to the empire around your neck? Were you testing me? Were you waiting to see if I would fail so you could take it all?" "No!" Elias barked, the force of his denial causing him to cough violently. He grimaced, clutching his bandaged chest. "Damn it, Victoria, listen to me!" She stopped, her chest heaving, her eyes wide and terrified. She looked like a bird trapped in a cage, waiting for the hunter to strike. Elias forced himself to meet her gaze, his hazel eyes burning with an intensity that cut through the fever. "My father gave me that key on his deathbed," Elias said, his voice a low, ragged rasp. "He told me the truth about the gold. He told me about Thomas. But he also told me that the land didn't mean a damn thing without the sweat and the blood poured into it. He told me that Thomas had built an empire, and that he had built it with a woman who had a spine of pure steel." Elias swallowed hard, the effort costing him dearly. "I came here expecting to find a spoiled aristocrat who needed to be bailed out. I brought the key because I planned to take my half of the land and let you keep the rest. But then I walked into that church." Victoria's breath caught. "I watched you rack a Winchester in a wedding dress," Elias continued softly. "I watched you build a fortress out of sheer willpower. I watched you fight for your people, for your herd, for your survival. I realized that a piece of paper and 20-year-old gold didn't give me the right to take anything from you." Victoria stared at him, her lips parted in shock. "You own half of it, Elias," she whispered. "Legally, morally. It's yours." "I don't sign my name to fictions," Elias said, repeating the words he had spoken in her parlor weeks ago. "And I didn't marry a piece of land, Victoria." Elias pushed himself up. The pain was blinding, white-hot and agonizing, but he ignored it. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, his bare chest heaving, sweat pouring down his face. "Elias, what are you doing? You'll tear the stitches!" Victoria cried, rushing forward to stop him. Elias caught her wrists. He pulled her gently toward him, ignoring the fiery protest in his shattered collarbone. He looked down at the letters clutched in her hands. "I want you to have them," he whispered, his face inches from hers. "Burn them. Keep them. I don't care. I don't want the empire, Victoria. I just want you." The absolute sincerity in his eyes shattered the last stubborn remnants of Victoria Sterling's armor. With a choked sob, the letters tumbled from her hands, scattering across the Persian rug. She threw her arms around his neck, mindful of his wounded shoulder, and buried her face in his chest. Elias wrapped his good arm around her waist, pulling her flush against his uninjured side. He buried his face in her dark, tangled hair, breathing in the scent of lavender and smoke. She pulled back just enough to look up at him. Her stormy eyes were entirely unguarded, blazing with a fierce, desperate passion. "You reckless, stupid, magnificent man," she breathed. And then she kissed him. It wasn't a gentle, hesitant touch. It was a collision. It was the explosive release of weeks of agonizing tension, forced proximity, and the terrifying realization of how close they had come to losing each other. Victoria kissed him like she was dying of thirst, and he was the first drop of rain. Elias groaned, his good hand tangling in her hair, angling her head to deepen the kiss. The taste of her was intoxicating, a mix of saltwater tears and absolute fiery devotion. Victoria pushed him gently backward, forcing him to lie flat on the pillows before he collapsed from the pain. She followed him down, her body blanketing his uninjured side, her mouth never leaving his. She kissed his jaw, his cheek, the pulse racing at the base of his throat, murmuring his name like a prayer. For the first time in her life, Victoria surrendered control. She didn't yield to a master, she yielded to a partner. She yielded to a man who had proven, with his own blood, that he would never use her vulnerability against her. Elias held her tightly, the agony in his shoulder fading into the background, eclipsed by the blinding, overwhelming heat of the woman in his arms. The slow burn had finally caught fire, and it threatened to burn the entire manor to the ground. They lay together for hours in the quiet aftermath, the fire in the hearth burning down to glowing red embers. Victoria was curled against his good side, her head resting on his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring thud of his heart. Elias stroked her hair, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, but his soul entirely at peace. The war was over. The empire was secure. And the woman who trusted no one had finally placed her entire heart in his hands. He closed his eyes, ready to let the sleep finally claim him. Clang! 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 The violent, frantic ringing of the massive iron ranch bell shattered the peaceful dawn. Elias's eyes snapped open. The bell was only used for one thing, a full-scale emergency. Heavy, frantic footsteps pounded down the hallway. The bedroom door burst open without a knock. Gideon stood in the doorway, a Winchester in his hands, his face pale and tight with fury. "I'm sorry to interrupt, Lady Sterling," Gideon panted, his eyes darting between Elias and Victoria. "But you need to get up, right damn now." Victoria sat up, pulling the sheets around herself, her aristocratic composure snapping back into place instantly. "What is it, Gideon? Did the river flood the lower pastures?" "No," Gideon said grimly, racking the lever of his rifle. "It's Silas Vance. He didn't run when the dam broke. He grouped up with the rest of the Pinkerton detachment from the rail yard." Elias forced himself into a sitting position, a cold dread pooling in his stomach. "How many?" 30 men, Gideon said, his knuckles white on the rifle stock. "Heavily armed. They just breached the main gate. They're surrounding the manor." Vance hadn't come for a legal battle. He hadn't come for the water. Outraged by the destruction of his dam and the humiliation of his defeat, Silas Vance had come for blood. He had come to wipe the Sterling Empire off the map entirely. Elias looked at Victoria. The peaceful vulnerability of the night was gone. In its place was the terrifying, magnificent Valkyrie he had seen on the ridge. "Get my boots, Gideon," Victoria said coldly, swinging her legs out of bed, "and bring me my rifle." Elias gritted his teeth, pushing through the agonizing pain to stand beside her. The final battle for the valley had just begun. The morning sky over the Sterling Ranch was a fragile, bruised purple when the first volley of gunfire shattered the opulent facade of the manor. Inside the master suite, the world descended into immediate, deafening chaos. The massive arched windows facing the eastern courtyard exploded inward, a lethal rain of shattered glass and splintered mahogany tearing across the Persian rugs. Elias didn't hesitate, pain or no pain. The battle-hardened instincts of a man who had lived his life on the razor's edge took over. He grabbed Victoria by the waist with his good arm and threw them both to the hardwood floor just as a second barrage of bullets chewed the plaster above the bed to dust. "Stay low!" Elias roared over the deafening cacophony. He crawled toward the overturned heavy oak armoire, dragging his Colt and gun belt with him. His right shoulder was a screaming, white-hot agony, the fresh stitches threatening to tear with every movement. His white linen bandages were already blooming with fresh, bright crimson. Victoria didn't cower. She scrambled across the glass-strewn floor, reaching beneath the bed to retrieve the Winchester she had kept loaded since the dam broke. She racked the lever, her eyes devoid of fear, replaced by a cold, murderous fury. They were destroying her home. "Gideon!" Victoria shouted, her voice cutting through the din. The foreman was pinned in the hallway, returning fire down the grand staircase. "They've surrounded the perimeter. 30 men, maybe more. They're using the stone retaining walls of the garden for cover." "We can't hold them off from up here," Elias yelled, his mind calculating the angles. "If they breach the first floor and set fire to the parlor, we'll burn alive. We have to hold the main doors." "Then we go down," Victoria declared. They moved as a unit. Elias strapped his gun belt around his hips, favoring his left hand, his right arm bound tightly against his chest by his torn shirt to prevent the shattered collarbone from shifting. Victoria took the lead, her rifle raised, moving down the grand staircase with the lethal grace of a predator defending its den. The ground floor was a war zone. The beautiful, opulent parlor where Victoria had once stitched Elias's ribs was unrecognizable. Gun smoke hung thick in the air, choking and acrid. The ranch hands, Garrett, Pine, and a dozen others, had taken up defensive positions behind overturned velvet sofas and heavy oak dining tables, exchanging furious fire with the Pinkertons outside. "Hold the line," Gideon bellowed, firing his shotgun through a shattered window. Elias dropped behind the remnants of a mahogany bookshelf, Victoria sliding in right beside him. He drew his Colt with his left hand. It felt awkward, unbalanced, but out here, a man adapted, or he died. He leveled the heavy barrel over the splintered wood and fired twice. A Pinkerton thug trying to sprint across the courtyard dropped like a stone. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" The voice echoed from the courtyard, amplified by the heavy morning air. It was a slick, aristocratic drawl that made Victoria's blood run cold. Silas Vance. The gunfire slowly tapered off, leaving only the ringing in their ears and the groans of the wounded. "Lady Sterling," Vance's voice called out from behind the heavy stone fountain in the center of the drive. "You put up a spirited fight, I'll give you that. But my men have you completely surrounded. You have 20 guns inside, I have 30 trained killers out here. It's simple mathematics." Victoria's grip on her Winchester tightened until her knuckles turned stark white. She aimed through the broken window, but Vance was entirely concealed behind the stone. "What do you want, Vance?" Elias shouted back, his voice a deep, gravelly boom that carried easily over the courtyard. "I want the true heir," Vance yelled back, a cruel laugh lacing his words. "Word travels fast in this territory, Thorne. A little bird from the land office told me about the addendum to Thomas Sterling's will. I know who you are, but a dead heir can't claim a valley." Victoria's breath hitched. Vance wasn't just here to destroy the ranch. He was here to eliminate the only legal threat to his monopoly. "Send Thorne out, and sign over the water rights, Victoria," Vance demanded. "Do that, and I'll let you and your ranch hands ride away. Refuse, and we burn the manor to the ground with everyone inside." "Go to hell, Silas!" Victoria screamed, raising her rifle. Elias placed his left hand over the barrel of her Winchester, gently pushing it down. He looked around the ruined parlor. 2 of their men were bleeding. They were running low on ammunition. The wooden walls of the manor wouldn't withstand a fire. Vance was a coward, but he had the numbers to make good on his threat. "Elias, no," Victoria whispered, seeing the terrifying, calm resolve settling over his scarred face. "Do not even think about it. We fight them to the last bullet. If we do that, Gideon dies. Garrett dies. You die," Elias said softly, his hazel eyes locking onto hers. The fever still burned in his blood, but his mind was crystal clear. Vance is a businessman, but underneath all that money, he's an arrogant, prideful coward. He wants to prove he's the king of this valley. I'm going to give him the chance. Elias stood up slowly, ignoring the blinding agony in his chest. "Thorne, don't!" Gideon hissed from across the room. "Vance!" Elias roared, stepping into the center of the shattered doorway, fully exposed to the courtyard. 30 rifles instantly aimed at his chest. "You want me? You want the claim to this valley? Then earn it like a man. Silence fell over the courtyard. "A duel, Silas!" Elias called out, his voice dripping with unmistakable contempt. "Just you and me in the dirt. You win, the valley is yours. I win. You and your Pinkertons leave the Sterling Empire and never come back. Or are you too busy hiding behind your hired guns to finish what you started?" A tense, heavy silence hung in the crisp morning air. The wind howled through the canyon, kicking up a swirl of dry red dust that rolled across the courtyard like a ghost. Slowly, from behind the stone fountain, Silas Vance stepped out. He wore a pristine, tailored charcoal suit, looking absurdly out of place amidst the blood and mud. He smiled, a thin, serpentine curving of his lips. He saw Elias holding his right arm tight against his chest, bleeding through his bandages, forced to draw with his offhand. To Vance, it looked like a guaranteed execution. "A classic Western showdown," Vance sneered, stepping into the open clearing. "How delightfully archaic. I accept your terms, Mr. Thorne." "Elias, you can't draw with your left hand," Victoria whispered fiercely, grabbing the back of his duster. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced her chest. "He's going to kill you!" Elias turned to her. He didn't offer a reassuring smile. He offered the grim, absolute certainty of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. "I won't miss," Elias said softly. "But Vance is a snake. He won't play fair. When he breaks the rules, Victoria, I need you to have my back." Victoria looked into his eyes, her breath catching. He was trusting her with his life. Completely. Without hesitation. The panic vanished, replaced by the lethal, icy focus of the Lady of the Valley. She nodded once, a sharp, violent jerk of her chin. "I'll cover you." Elias turned and walked down the wooden steps. His boots hit the dirt courtyard. The wind whipped the hem of his black canvas duster around his calves. He walked exactly 20 paces toward the fountain, stopping 10 yards away from Silas Vance. The 30 Pinkerton guards watched in absolute silence, their rifles lowered but ready. The ranch hands watched from the shattered windows of the manor. Up on the second-story balcony, hidden entirely by the shadows of a heavy velvet drape, Victoria leveled her Winchester, her eye pressed to the iron sights, her finger resting feather-light on the trigger. "You're a fool, Thorne," Vance said, his hand hovering over the pearl-handled revolver strapped to his hip. "You should have stayed a ghost." Elias didn't speak. He widened his stance, his left hand hovering over the worn walnut grip of his Colt. The pain in his right shoulder was a roaring inferno, but he pushed it away. There was only the wind, the dust, the man in front of him. A tumbleweed broke loose from the fencing, rolling silently across the dead space between them. Tick. Vance's eyes narrowed. Tick. Elias saw the imperceptible shift in Vance's weight, but Vance didn't reach for the revolver on his hip. He was a coward. He had never intended to draw fair. With a flick of his wrist, a hidden spring-loaded derringer slid out from the sleeve of Vance's tailored suit directly into his palm. He raised it in a fraction of a second, aiming straight for Elias's heart. Crack! The shot didn't come from the courtyard. It came from the balcony. Victoria didn't miss. The heavy .44-40 round from her Winchester shattered the morning air, tearing through the sleeve of Silas Vance's expensive suit and obliterating the derringer and two of his fingers in a spray of crimson and shattered metal. Vance shrieked, a high-pitched sound of pure agony, spinning wildly as his weapon was destroyed. In the exact same heartbeat, Elias drew. His left hand was a blur of lethal, practiced motion. He didn't even aim. It was pure muscle memory, forged in the fires of a dozen deadly encounters. The Colt roared in his hand. The heavy bullet struck Silas Vance dead center in the chest. The impact lifted the railroad tycoon off his feet, throwing him backward into the dirt. He hit the ground and didn't move. The silence that followed was absolute. The ringing echo of the two perfectly synchronized gunshots bounced off the canyon walls, fading into the howl of the wind. Elias stood perfectly still, his Colt smoking in his left hand, his breathing heavy and ragged. The Pinkerton guards stared at the lifeless body of their employer. They looked up at the balcony, where Victoria Sterling stood in plain sight, her Winchester racked and ready to fire again. They looked at the shattered windows of the manor where 20 hardened ranch hands had their weapons trained directly on them. Without Silas Vance to pay them, there was no reason to die for this dirt. One by one, the hired guns lowered their rifles. A man at the front unbuckled his gun belt, letting it drop heavily into the mud. The others followed suit. They turned and began the long, silent walk back toward town. Elias let out a long, shuddering breath, the adrenaline finally leaving his system. His legs felt like lead. The Colt slipped from his fingers, falling into the dust. He swayed dangerously, the blood loss and fever finally claiming their toll. Before his knees could hit the dirt, she was there. Victoria crashed into him, wrapping her arms around his waist, burying her face in his uninjured shoulder. She was shaking violently, the iron facade completely stripped away, leaving only the woman who loved him fiercely. Elias wrapped his good arm around her, burying his face in her dark hair, inhaling the scent of gun smoke and lavender. "You had my back," Elias whispered, his voice failing. "Always," Victoria swore into his coat, holding him as if she could physically anchor his soul to the earth. "I will always have your back, Elias Thorne." The smoke cleared over the courtyard. The siege was broken. The king and queen of the valley stood victorious in the dust. The empire finally and eternally secured. 6 weeks had passed since the siege at Stirling Manor. Spring had surrendered to a vibrant golden summer. The Sweetwater Creek roared with life, the reservoir restored to its natural, thunderous glory. The herd was thriving, grazing across thousands of acres of lush, emerald-green pastures. The shattered windows of the manor had been replaced, the splintered mahogany repaired, and the blood had been washed from the courtyard stones. Elias Thorne stood in the cool, shadowed quiet of the main barn. Dust motes danced in the shafts of golden sunlight piercing through the slatted roof. His right arm was out of the sling, the shattered collarbone having healed with the stubborn, resilient speed of a man used to hard living. He still favored it, a dull ache lingering deep in the joint, but he could ride and he could shoot. He ran a soft bristle brush over the sleek flank of his black gelding, his movements slow and methodical. Thrown over the wooden stall door was a pair of heavy packed leather saddlebags. He was leaving. It wasn't a decision made in anger. It was a decision made in love, the deepest, most agonizing kind of love a man could feel. Elias had spent the last 6 weeks recovering in the master suite. He and Victoria had shared the nights, tangled in the sheets, exploring a passion that burned brighter and hotter than the sun over the plains. They had shared the days, rebuilding the ranch, negotiating new railroad contracts without Vance's shadow hanging over them, functioning as a seamless, unstoppable partnership. But Elias couldn't forget the words Victoria had spoken in the freezing line cabin. "I swore to God that I would never, ever surrender control of my life to another human being. She had been sold by her father. She had been a prisoner to her first husband." Elias knew that as long as they were legally married, as long as he held the claim to half her empire, a part of her would always feel caged. She had yielded to him in a moment of desperation, in the aftermath of near death. But he loved her too fiercely to let her live the rest of her life wondering if she was truly free. He had fulfilled his father's dying wish. The blood debt was settled. He had protected the Stirling Empire, and he had protected the woman who ruled it. Now, the greatest gift he could give her was her absolute sovereignty. He tightened the buckles on the saddlebags, his chest tight with a grief he refused to let surface. "You're putting the cinch on too tight. He won't breathe right on the trail." Elias froze. He turned around. Victoria was standing in the open doorway of the barn, backlit by the brilliant morning sun. She was wearing her tailored riding habit, her dark hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders. She looked breathtakingly beautiful, but her storm-gray eyes were locked onto the saddlebags, and they were blazing with a dangerous, volatile fire. "Just checking the leather," Elias lied smoothly, turning back to the horse. "Needs a little oil before winter." "Don't lie to me, Elias Thorne," Victoria said, stepping into the barn. The heels of her boots clicked sharply against the hard-packed dirt. "Gideon told me you asked him to prepare your severance pay. I told him if he opened the safe, I'd shoot him myself." Elias sighed, resting his forehead against the gelding's warm neck for a fraction of a second before turning to face her. "Victoria," he started, his voice gentle but firm. "The threat is gone. Vance is dead. The Pinkertons won't come back. The territorial judge ratified the deeds yesterday. The empire is entirely secure. And your first instinct is to pack your bags and sneak out like a thief in the night?" she demanded, closing the distance between them. She stopped 2 feet away, her chest heaving, a fierce flush of anger on her cheeks. "After everything we've bled for? After everything we've shared?" "Because of what we've shared," Elias corrected softly. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. She trembled at the touch but didn't pull away. "You built this place from the dirt, Victoria. It's yours. It's your soul. I told you I didn't come here to take anything from you. If If I claim my half as your legal husband, you'll never truly be free. You'll always be tied to a man you were forced to marry." Victoria stared at him, her anger evaporating, replaced by a profound, breathtaking realization. He wasn't running from her. He was sacrificing his own happiness, his own legacy, to protect her independence. He was the only man in her entire life who had ever possessed the power to rule her, and he was choosing to walk away so she could wear the crown alone. Victoria reached into the pocket of her riding jacket. She pulled out a thick, folded piece of parchment. It was the original marriage contract. The cold, ironclad document she had forced him to sign on his first night in the manor. "You're right," Victoria said, her voice dropping to a soft, husky whisper. "I hated being forced. I hated being a pawn, and I swore I would never surrender control to anyone." She walked past him toward the small iron forge in the back of the barn, where a bed of coals still glowed red-hot from the morning's blacksmithing. Without a moment of hesitation, Victoria tossed the marriage contract directly onto the coals. Elias watched as the thick parchment curled, blackened, and burst into brilliant, consuming flame. Within seconds, the document that bound them was nothing but white ash floating into the rafters. Victoria turned back to him, the firelight reflecting in her luminous eyes. "I don't need a shield anymore, Elias," she said, her voice thick with raw, unrestrained emotion. She closed the distance between them, reaching up to grip the heavy canvas lapels of his duster. "I don't want a legal fiction. I don't want a co-owner." She pulled him down slightly, her face inches from his. "I want the man who broke a wild roan in the mud. I want the man who threw himself in front of a bullet for me. I want the man who sacrificed his own empire just to make sure I felt free." Victoria's voice broke on a soft sob, her hands sliding up to cup his jaw. "I am absolutely, entirely free, Elias Thorne. And I am choosing to surrender my heart to you. I need my husband." Elias's breath left him in a rush. The heavy burden he had carried for 6 weeks, the fear that he was trapping her, vanished into the dust, leaving only a blinding, overwhelming joy. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Elias wrapped both arms around her waist, lifting her clean off the ground, and kissed her. It was a sweeping, cinematic kiss that tasted of the wild Montana frontier, of promises kept, and of a love forged in the crucible of survival. Victoria wrapped her arms around his neck, kissing him back with a fierce, possessive desperation, her tears mingling with the dust on his cheeks. He set her down slowly, resting his forehead against hers. They were both breathing hard, wrapped in the quiet sanctuary of the barn, bathed in the golden light of the morning. "You aren't going anywhere, Mr. Thorne," Victoria whispered against his lips, a watery, radiant smile breaking across her face. "You are going to unpack those saddlebags. You are going to walk back into our manor, and you are going to help me rule this valley." Elias smiled, the rugged, genuine smile of a man who had finally, after a lifetime of wandering, found exactly where he belonged. "Yes, ma'am," he murmured, kissing her once more, soft and lingering. Later that evening, as the Montana sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the mountains, painting the sky in breathtaking strokes of violet, crimson, and gold, Elias and Victoria stood together on the balcony of the master suite. Elias stood behind her, his arms wrapped securely around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. Victoria leaned back into his solid warmth, her hands resting over his. They looked out over the sprawling, limitless expanse of the Sterling Empire. The herd was a sea of dark shapes moving peacefully in the twilight. The bunkhouse echoed with the faint sounds of a fiddle and the laughter of their men. The Sweetwater Creek shone like a ribbon of liquid silver in the fading light. It was no longer just a fortress built on fear and cold calculation. It was a home, earned in blood, defended with honor, and anchored by an unbreakable bond. Elias Thorne had ridden west to honor a dying wish. He had expected to find a debt. Instead, he had found his queen, his equal, and a love that would outlast the very mountains that guarded their valley. Together they watched the stars pull back the curtain of the night, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring. They were ready. They were one. And the empire was theirs.